George Pullman was a Chicago industrialist and a complex business figure who became one of the most controversial entrepreneurs of the Gilded Age. George Mortimer Pullman, railroad car manufacturer and later town builder, was born in Brockton, New York on March 3, 1831. He came from a modest family. He had a keen business sense and an eye for opportunity. Pullman's early years were marked by ambition and determination. He received only a basic education, leaving school at age 14 to work with his father, a carpenter and general contractor. His practical education in construction and engineering shaped his understanding of mechanics and business, though his later career would test those lessons in the most brutal ways imaginable. After his father's death in 1853, Pullman took over the family business at age 22. He moved to Chicago, a rapidly growing city that offered opportunities for an ambitious young contractor. He was hired to raise buildings and streets above the marshy ground that plagued the city. It was during this time that Pullman began developing his ideas about engineering solutions to practical problems. His most famous project involved raising the Tremorne House Hotel for feet while guests continued to occupy the building. The feat demonstrated his engineering skill and brought him recognition in Chicago business circles. In 1858, Pullman turned his attention to a problem that had long troubled railroad passengers: the discomfort of overnight train travel. He had experienced firsthand the crude sleeping cars then in use, which were little more than regular coaches with wooden bunks. Pullman believed he could design something far superior. He converted two passenger cars on the Chicago and Alton Railroad into sleeping cars with his own money. The cars featured folding upper berths and seat cushions that could be extended to form lower berths. However, despite the improvements, the cars were still cramped and uncomfortable. The venture showed promise but needed refinement. Pullman's business venture initially showed limited success. His sleeping cars attracted some attention from railroad officials and travelers alike. However, despite the technical merits of his design, the business side of the enterprise proved challenging. Railroads were reluctant to invest in expensive passenger accommodations. They questioned whether travelers would pay premium fares for sleeping berths. Competition from other sleeping car manufacturers also threatened his enterprise. Pullman realized he needed something revolutionary, not merely improved. In 1859, Pullman temporarily left the railroad car business and moved to Colorado, where gold had been discovered. He operated a trading post in the mining camps, selling supplies to prospectors. The venture was profitable and allowed him to accumulate capital for his future plans. During his time in Colorado, Pullman continued to refine his vision for the perfect sleeping car. He sketched designs and calculated costs. By 1863, he had saved enough money and was ready to return to Chicago to pursue his dream. After returning to Chicago, Pullman began work on his masterpiece. He invested $20,000, an enormous sum at the time, to build a sleeping car unlike anything previously seen. The car, named Pioneer, was completed in 1864. It was larger, more luxurious, and more expensive than any previous sleeping car. The Pioneer featured elaborate woodwork, plush upholstery, and innovative mechanical systems for converting seats into beds. It had marble washstands, ornate oil lamps, and fine linens. The car was so large that it could not fit on most railroad lines, being too wide and too tall for existing platforms and bridges. The Pioneer sat unused for months because railroads refused to modify their infrastructure to accommodate it. Pullman's investment seemed destined to fail. However, legend holds that fate intervened when President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in April 1865. When Lincoln's funeral train carried his body from Washington back to Springfield, Illinois, the Pioneer was supposedly attached to the train. Railroads along the route hastily modified their platforms and bridges to allow the magnificent car to pass. Whether this story is entirely accurate remains debated by historians, but the Pioneer did eventually run on the Chicago and Alton Railroad, and its success launched Pullman's empire. Following the success of the Pioneer, Pullman formed the Pullman Palace Car Company in 1867. His business model was innovative for its time. Rather than selling sleeping cars to railroads, Pullman retained ownership of the cars and leased them to railroad companies. The railroads paid Pullman a fee per mile traveled, and Pullman's company maintained and staffed the cars. This arrangement gave Pullman control over quality and service while generating steady revenue. Passengers paid a supplemental fare to use the sleeping cars, which was split between the railroad and Pullman's company. Pullman sleeping cars quickly became the standard for luxury rail travel. He continually improved his designs, introducing innovations like the dining car in 1868 and the chair car for day travel. By the 1870s, Pullman Palace cars were operating on most major railroads across America. The distinctive dark green cars with gold lettering became symbols of elegance and comfort. Wealthy travelers demanded Pullman accommodations, and even middle-class passengers saved money to experience the luxury of sleeping in a Pullman berth. The company's success made Pullman enormously wealthy. By 1875, the Pullman Palace Car Company was manufacturing cars at a large facility in Detroit. However, Pullman envisioned something grander, a purpose-built town where his cars would be manufactured and his workers would live. In 1880, he purchased 4,000 acres of land south of Chicago, near Lake Calumet. There he would build his ideal community, a town that would bear his name and embody his vision of industrial efficiency and social order. The town of Pullman, Illinois, was designed from the ground up as a model industrial community. Pullman hired architect Solon Spencer Beman and landscape designer Nathan Barrett to create a town that would be both functional and beautiful. Construction began in 1880 and proceeded rapidly. By 1881, the first workers were moving into company-owned houses. The town featured neat rows of brick houses, wide streets, parks, and public buildings. There was a hotel, a church, a library, a theater, shops, and schools. Everything was owned by the Pullman Company. Pullman's vision for his town was paternalistic and controlling. He believed that by providing workers with clean, comfortable housing and wholesome surroundings, he could create a more productive and loyal workforce. Workers would be free from the corrupting influences of saloons and slums that plagued other industrial cities. In return for these benefits, workers would accept company control over virtually every aspect of their lives. Rent was deducted directly from wages. The company determined who could live in the town and who would be evicted. No alcohol was sold except at the hotel, which was too expensive for workers. No independent newspapers or organizations were allowed. Initially, the town of Pullman was praised as a progressive experiment in industrial relations. Visitors came from around the world to tour the model community. Newspapers published glowing accounts of the clean streets, attractive houses, and contented workers. Pullman himself was celebrated as an enlightened capitalist who cared for his employees' welfare. The town won awards at industrial exhibitions. Reformers held it up as an example of how capitalism could be humanized through enlightened management. However, beneath the attractive surface, resentment was growing among Pullman workers. They chafed under the company's control. They resented paying rent to their employer, knowing that Pullman was profiting from their housing. They disliked the restrictions on their freedom and the constant surveillance by company officials. They complained that rents were higher than for comparable housing in nearby communities. They noted that while Pullman preached about his concern for workers, he was also making enormous profits from the town's operations. The Pullman Company continued to prosper through the 1880s. The business expanded internationally, with Pullman cars operating in Europe and Asia. Pullman himself became one of America's wealthiest men. He built a mansion on Prairie Avenue in Chicago, the most fashionable address in the city. He socialized with other industrial titans like Marshall Field and Philip Armour. He served on corporate boards and invested in various enterprises. His success seemed to validate his business methods and his vision of industrial paternalism. In 1893, the United States entered a severe economic depression. The Panic of 1893 caused widespread business failures and unemployment. The Pullman Company saw demand for its luxury railroad cars plummet as railroads cancelled orders. Pullman responded by laying off workers and cutting wages for those who remained. Wages were reduced by an average of 25%. However, Pullman did not reduce rents in his company town or the prices at company stores. Workers found themselves with sharply reduced incomes but unchanged living expenses. The wage cuts without corresponding rent reductions created desperate conditions for Pullman workers. Many could barely afford food after rent was deducted from their paychecks. Some workers received paychecks for only a few cents after all deductions. Families went hungry. Workers pleaded with company officials for rent reductions or wage increases, but their appeals were rejected. The company maintained that business conditions necessitated the wage cuts and that the town's finances were separate from the manufacturing operations, so rents could not be adjusted. In May 1894, Pullman workers went on strike. They demanded wage increases, rent reductions, and recognition of their union. The strike began peacefully with workers simply refusing to work. The American Railway Union, led by Eugene V. Debs, supported the Pullman workers. In June, the ARU called for a boycott of all trains pulling Pullman cars. Railroad workers across the country refused to handle Pullman cars. The boycott paralyzed rail traffic throughout the western United States. Mail delivery was disrupted. Commerce ground to a halt. The conflict escalated from a local labor dispute to a national crisis. George Pullman refused to negotiate with the strikers. He rejected calls for arbitration. He insisted that there was nothing to arbitrate, that the company had every right to set wages and rents as it saw fit. He left Chicago for his summer home in New Jersey, leaving subordinates to deal with the crisis. His absence and his refusal to compromise hardened positions on both sides. The strike became a test of wills between labor and capital, with Pullman representing the absolute authority of employers. The federal government intervened in the strike, siding with the railroad companies and Pullman. President Grover Cleveland, citing disruption of mail delivery, sent federal troops to Chicago over the objections of Illinois Governor John Peter Altgeld. The arrival of troops led to violence. Rioting broke out. Railroad cars were burned. Strikers clashed with soldiers. Several people were killed. Eugene Debs was arrested for violating a federal injunction against interfering with the mails. The strike was broken by force. By July 1894, the Pullman strike was over. Workers returned to their jobs defeated, accepting the reduced wages and unchanged rents. Many strike leaders were blacklisted and never worked for Pullman again. The American Railway Union was destroyed. Eugene Debs went to prison. George Pullman had won the immediate battle, but the victory came at enormous cost to his reputation. Public opinion, which had initially supported suppression of the strike, turned against Pullman when the workers' conditions became widely known. A federal commission investigated the strike and issued a scathing report on Pullman's labor practices. The commission found that the company's refusal to reduce rents while cutting wages was unreasonable and had provoked the strike. It criticized the paternalistic system of the company town, noting that it gave workers no voice in their living conditions. The report recommended that the company divest itself of the town and that Congress consider legislation to prevent future labor conflicts. The findings embarrassed Pullman and damaged his standing among fellow businessmen. In the aftermath of the strike, Pullman became a symbol of corporate greed and labor exploitation. Newspapers that had once praised his model town now condemned it as a gilded cage. Ministers preached sermons denouncing his treatment of workers. Reform organizations used Pullman as an example of everything wrong with industrial capitalism. His name, once synonymous with luxury and progress, became associated with oppression and conflict. The man who had sought to be remembered as an enlightened employer would instead be remembered as a tyrant. The Illinois Supreme Court ordered the Pullman Company to divest itself of all property not directly related to manufacturing. The company town, the court ruled, was beyond the legitimate scope of a manufacturing corporation. This decision forced the eventual dissolution of Pullman's model community. The town was annexed by Chicago in 1889, though the actual annexation occurred later, and the houses were eventually sold to private owners. Pullman's grand experiment in industrial paternalism was legally dismantled. George Pullman never recovered from the strike and its aftermath. His health declined. He became increasingly isolated, bitter about what he saw as public ingratitude for his efforts to improve workers' lives. He could not understand why his paternalistic system, which he genuinely believed was beneficial, had generated such hatred. He felt betrayed by workers he thought he had treated generously. The man who had built an empire on the promise of comfort and luxury found neither in his final years. Throughout his post-strike years, Pullman continued to manage his company, but the joy had gone out of the work. The Pullman Palace Car Company remained profitable and dominant in its industry. The sleeping cars continued to operate on railroads across America and around the world. But the company's founder was a broken man, his reputation destroyed and his vision discredited. He maintained his business interests and his wealth, but he had lost something more valuable, his belief in his own righteousness. Pullman married Hattie Amelia Sanger in 1867, and they had 4 children. His family life provided some comfort during his difficult final years. His wife and children remained loyal despite the public criticism. They maintained the social position that Pullman's wealth afforded, though they felt the sting of his damaged reputation. Pullman ensured his family would be financially secure, whatever happened to his personal legacy. On October 19, 1897, George Pullman died at his home in Chicago. He was 66 years old. The cause of death was reported as a heart attack, though some accounts suggest he had been suffering from various ailments for some time. Pullman's funeral was a modest affair, reflecting the family's desire to avoid public attention. He was buried in Graceland Cemetery in Chicago. Fearing that his body might be stolen or desecrated by vengeful workers, his family had the coffin encased in tar paper and asphalt, then placed in a lead-lined vault, which was covered with concrete and railroad ties. The extraordinary measures reflected the depth of animosity that Pullman's labor policies had generated. In death, as in life, Pullman was remembered with a mixture of respect and resentment. His legacy is complex and contradictory. He was a genuine innovator who revolutionized railroad travel and created an industry. His sleeping cars made long-distance travel comfortable and accessible to millions. His business acumen built a commercial empire. Yet he was also a man whose paternalistic arrogance and refusal to compromise led to one of the most significant labor conflicts in American history. He cared about his workers in the abstract but refused to listen to them as individuals. He built them a beautiful town but denied them freedom and dignity. Modern historians have offered varied assessments of Pullman's legacy. Some emphasize his contributions to transportation and industrial development, noting that his innovations genuinely improved people's lives. They point out that his town, whatever its flaws, did provide better housing than most workers of that era enjoyed. They suggest that his paternalism, while misguided, came from a sincere belief that he knew what was best for his employees. Other historians focus on his labor practices, seeing Pullman as a symbol of Gilded Age exploitation and the arrogance of industrial capitalists who believed their wealth gave them the right to control workers' lives. The Pullman strike of 1894 had lasting consequences for American labor relations. It demonstrated the willingness of the federal government to use force to break strikes. It showed the power of industrial unions to disrupt the national economy. It raised questions about workers' rights and corporate power that would shape labor law for decades. The strike helped launch Eugene Debs's political career and contributed to the growth of the socialist movement in America. It remains one of the most studied labor conflicts in American history. Perhaps the most fitting assessment of George Pullman comes from recognizing the contradiction at the heart of his life's work. He built an empire on providing comfort and luxury to travelers while denying comfort and dignity to the workers who made that luxury possible. He created a model town that was admired for its physical beauty but despised by those forced to live there. He was an innovator who improved transportation but a reactionary who resisted changes in labor relations. He succeeded brilliantly in business but failed catastrophically in understanding human nature and human needs. Pullman represents a particular type of industrial leader common in the Gilded Age, the self-made man who believed his success proved his superiority and gave him the right to dictate how others should live. History is full of such figures, men who built great enterprises but whose paternalism and arrogance created conflict and suffering. Pullman's tragedy was that he never understood why his workers rejected his benevolence, why they preferred freedom and dignity to comfortable housing and steady employment under his control. In the end, George Pullman was neither a great benefactor nor a terrible villain, but rather a talented businessman who achieved remarkable success while failing to recognize the humanity and autonomy of his workers. His legacy includes both the revolutionary sleeping cars that transformed travel and the infamous strike that symbolized the conflict between labor and capital in industrial America. He is remembered today primarily for the strike and for the town that bore his name, which is perhaps unfair to a man who genuinely innovated and built, but also perhaps appropriate for a man whose arrogance and inflexibility caused such conflict. Pullman remained even in death a man of contradictions, remembered for his industrial achievements and his labor conflicts rather than for the complexity of his character and the sincerity of his misguided paternalism.